13 on 13 News Now. Okay.
Exactly. Wow.
Here now with Jeff, David, and Evan. And you guys have been working really, really hard following the path. And a lot of people have a lot of questions, so we're going to try to answer some of your questions during this Facebook Live. But let's get the latest on the track.
Well, at 6 o'clock, it was still holding steady with making a couple of turns, some different stuff. So I'm going to head over to the wall here, and we're going to talk about the watches and the warnings. I think most of you probably know by now that basically our North Carolina viewership is under a tornado. Well, actually, we're all under a tornado watch pretty much now up through Southside, but we'll get to that in a minute. We are under a hurricane. So many watches and warnings, it's hard to keep track. We are under a hurricane warning from the state line south as well as offshore, only for boaters. So I don't expect anybody to be going out in a boat anytime soon, but if so, you're under a hurricane warning even here in Virginia. Now back on land in Virginia, we are under a tropical storm warning. That means conditions are expected to be 39 miles per hour or more for the wind, sustained wind, anywhere from there up to 74 miles per hour here as we go through the next 24 hours. Talked about the different watches and the warnings. That includes now a tornado watch. Tornadoes can occur usually along the path and to the right, but in this case we've had some even to the north out ahead of it, especially early this morning when the storm was near South Carolina, parts of southern North Carolina. It was producing a number of tornado warnings. We're seeing fewer of those now. The thunderstorm heights are coming down a little bit, but anytime you get a storm like this, these feeder bands certainly have the potential to spin up some tornadoes. So this is until 7 o'clock in the morning that we are now under, again, for south side from Suffolk east. So in other words, pretty much just Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Portsmouth, Norfolk, and Suffolk down into North Carolina under a tornado watch until 7:30 in the morning. Current temperatures are at 78, but the wind already picking up now out of the northeast at 15 miles per hour. So tonight, the heavier and the steadier rain are going to continue to move in, and it will be very windy by late tonight. Windy early, very windy late. In fact, I think some of these numbers are underdone, as we'll talk about in a minute. But you can see by 1 o'clock in the morning, some of these rain bands, heavy at times, continue. Temperatures in the 70s at that point. The wind sustained out of the northeast, mid-20s. That's fairly reasonable. I would think that's a little bit low. Once we get into tomorrow, we're saying 30 or 35 to 50 sustained for coastal Virginia. This is on the low end of that, so we're thinking it could possibly be higher, as we said, sustained, maybe up to 50, and gusts eventually could approach hurricane force, easily 55 to 60 or 65, and I would not doubt we get a couple of gusts higher than that. Here we are just after the lunch hour, or for some people during the lunch hour. The storm is east of Hatteras. The winds are howling out of the north at that point, and we're at low tide an hour or two before this, and the tides are starting to come up. That's going to be a major issue even as the heaviest of the rain moves out. By the time we're on here tomorrow at 4 o'clock doing the 4:30, 5 o'clock news, the heavy rain should be offshore, but the winds, I think these are underdone. They're going to be sustained probably inland at that number, but closer to the coastline, 30 to 40, 45, and some higher gusts than that. And that's going to drive all that water here, especially into parts of Southside that face open to the north, like the Lynn Haven Inlet and areas like that. And then by 8:30, the storm continues to pull out to sea, and it gives us a pretty nice weekend. So here is the system. Notice the last few hours. It heads north, and then look at that very distinct turn to the or to the northeast. I think you can clearly see that. That is really good news. If we could keep that going and get the storm to pass 30 or 20 or 30 miles southeast of Hatteras, it would definitely make a difference in their forecast for the southern Outer Banks. It would make a difference in our forecast as well. So Friday, 2 o'clock in the morning, that's coming up again here not too many hours from now. In other words, late this evening during the overnight, Category 2, not a 22. It puts one symbol on top of the other for some reason. Category 2, 105 mile per hour winds just to the east of Wilmington near Cape Fear, and then continuing again. Maybe we can get it out here. It would be a little bit nicer than over the land or back inland, since the right-hand side of a storm is the most devastating part. And then as we get into Friday afternoon, 100 miles per hour but offshore and continuing to work its way to the north and east and transition into more of a hybrid storm eventually. So for North Carolina, rain, tide surge, and wind, all the threat is about as high as we get around here, and there's a moderate tornado risk as well. And I meant to change this earlier, but we were getting this live shot ready, so we have to put the tornado risk even now for parts of Virginia up into a yellow category. Rain, orange, and wind, orange, although closer to the coastline you get, the more significant it'll be. But the only area that will that we would use red, for example. Some of you are going to go, you only had orange for wind, not red. Well, then what are we going to do when we get sustained winds of 70 or 80 or 90? That would be red. So with wind gusts to only 60-something, we're going to go with the orange for wind. Tides and surge, though, extremely high. Here are some of the gusts and some of the times that they'll be occurring. And this is a rough estimate, obviously, but as we get into tomorrow morning, some of these wind gusts are going to be 50, 60 miles per hour. And in Hatteras, there was even a 70 or more earlier. And now with the storm right on top of them that time of the morning, they'll be in the eye. So if you're watching from down there, don't get fooled as the storm pulls out and you get the backside of this area coming in with 80 or even 90 mile per hour gusts from the west. That'll drive all that water that had to get shoved into the Albemarle Sound, into the Pamlico Sound, into the Currituck Sound, has nowhere to go. So when the wind comes around to the west, it slams it into places like Collington and back down toward, again, Manio and Roanoke Island, some of those locations. And then as it pulls out, the winds begin to ease. Still in Hampton, look at tomorrow afternoon, 55, 60 in Virginia Beach, maybe even a little bit higher, and then gradually that begins to improve. So for tonight, heavier and steadier rain and very windy conditions moving in late. Tomorrow 76 with some major tidal flooding. So that's pretty much what I have for now. We have a lot more coming up though. So let's go to Evan, Janet, and David. What do you guys have?
Well, we got some questions.
Okay.
Dee has a question about Back Bay, Evan, that area that floods badly and creates in Knott's Island. What can you help Dee understand about that?
Well, a lot of time Back Bay, that area floods in southern Virginia Beach when you get those southerly winds. This is one of those cases where the winds will start out of the northeast, then the north, and then the northwest. So while there will likely be some issues with the heavy rain, it's not one of those situations like we see when those strong southerly winds come up and we get that flooding as all that water works its way up from the Currituck Sound up into areas of Back Bay. So I don't think that that will be as big of an issue, but still, that's a low-lying area, and there's still the potential, certainly, for that flooding down there, but not like we typically see with those southwest winds.
Dee, I hope that helps.
And we also have someone asking about the Currituck Sound, which you just mentioned.
Right.
Right. Again, this, a lot of times when the storm is pulling away, we see those winds blowing down the sound, and we actually see the water levels get lower down through the Currituck Sound, and then they get a lot higher once you work your way down to the Outer Banks of Dare County. That's why we talk about the sound side flooding for places like Manio and Roanoke Island and over towards the Outer Banks.
And if we could actually bring up Weather 1, I'll show everybody exactly what we're talking about and do a little bit of drawing on here. So what Evan's talking about is when we have, whether it's the Currituck Sound or the Back Bay area, when we get that north and northeast wind, there's no way to drive the water into the sound, really. It takes, like Hurricane Isabel that came up inland, when you get a storm in a position that's more inland, or when you get any kind of a front, you get that counterclockwise flow around it, and you end up with those winds, again, coming in out of the south, and that drives all the water from the Currituck Sound back up around areas there into Virginia, around Knott's Island, and continuing to the north. So I would expect some flooding, again, as we were just talking about, in some of those areas around Back Bay, but it's going to be a combination. You'll have some tidal flooding, but it will not be anything like some of the big-time storms. But in fact, at some point, when the wind shifts around tomorrow afternoon to westerly, you'll see very, very low water. Let me get in here, like some of the creek, like Muddy Creek Road, Back Bay Landing, some Mill Landing, some of these roads will have very low water levels, actually, as the wind all gets shoved over to the east, and there will be very high water levels along the state park, the western edge of the state park, which of course nobody lives there. So that'll be some good news for you once the wind does turn to the west.
All right, Dan Bracy, he wants to know about rainfall estimates, particularly for Lynn Haven Shores and Virginia Beach.
Right, and I know there's a lot of concern about a lot of those areas in Virginia Beach with the flooding that we saw with
In Matthew.
Sure.
And the one thing is, coming up into Matthew, just a couple of weeks before that, we had another tropical system that brought like 12 to 14 inches of rain, and then we had the Matthew rain on top of it. So we're still looking at probably in the 4 to 8 inch rainfall amounts there through that part of Virginia Beach. If it's spread out over time, we shouldn't see as many issues like we did with Matthew, just because we're coming into only about 2 inches above normal so far for the year, as opposed to the 14 or 15 that we did with Matthew. And you know, almost the same sort of thing with Isabel. We had a saturated ground that the storm came in. That's why we had so many trees that were down. The roots just couldn't hold into the ground, so we're not likely going to see that. Jeff has a rainfall estimate map that he's just pulled up right there.
You can put that up there, and you'll see that this is the European model, and it has some of these areas here around Nags Head and up toward Elizabeth City in that sort of brown. Well, that's 5+ inches, so let's say 5 to 8 or more inches. And then it has generally sort of the reds over Hampton Roads, over South Side anyway, and that's roughly 2 to 5 inches, but it's going to depend on where the band's set up. And then across the peninsula, parts of the middle peninsula, you get more of the yellows, which is 1 to 2 inches. So that's just that one particular model. You can see the same general idea here as we put on the American model, but it's about 30 or so miles shifted to the northwest. So instead of the 8-inch amounts down over eastern North Carolina, it takes them from Edenton back up into parts of Virginia
That looks
Beach.
like a brand new model run that just came in, Jeff, because that's a little bit different than what we were seeing earlier.
Yeah, so again, has some of the
that a little
heaviest
more?
up
That's Saturday,
into-
7 p.m.
Well, that's just the running total through Saturday.
Okay,
The
all right.
rain will be over by Friday afternoon. That's a running total through Saturday.
See how it doesn't add on at all. Now we're back here. Don't get anything new. Here we go. So it ends Friday, it's changing. So
Okay.
here we go. Friday evening is when it starts changing.
Okay.
So that's a little bit of a shift, and that would, you know, again, be a 30-mile difference depending on the exact track of the storm.
But there's still going to be that sharp cutoff in western Hampton Roads where once you get back closer to Richmond and I-95, we're not going to see, you know, nearly as much rain as coastal areas if this track holds.
And when you said rain spread out, you're talking about maybe starting tonight around or overnight around 2 a.m.
Right, we'll get a
or-
few of the bands coming in. We've already got a couple of those showers working their way in, but I think the heavier and steadier rain will be, say, after about 2 a.m.
Okay.
We're getting some questions about evacuations, and keep those questions coming. You help fuel this conversation. We want you to be a part of it. We don't make the call on evacuations. City officials do that. But based on forecasting, do you anticipate there'll be needs for more evacuations than we already have ordered?
Well, I think the other issue with the evacuations is if you start issuing them now, there's just not enough time.
Time to get to safety.
Because it's starting to get dark. And, you know, here in the next few hours, we're really going to start to get some of the breezy conditions, and then the winds will pick up a bit. So I think it's a little bit late for any officials to start making any of those kind of calls for anything mandatory. We've got the voluntary evacuations pretty much in Zone A's, I believe in Chesapeake, Virginia Beach, Norfolk, and Portsmouth. So we do have those out, and we already have a lot of the mandatory evacuations down in northeastern North Carolina.
And Sandbridge.
And Sandbridge, yes, we got the mandatory there. So I don't think that we're going to see any other evacuation orders coming out at this late in the game.
Hopefully people did what they needed to do based on where they live.
Right.
All right, so high tide. So let's talk a little bit about that because the rain will be over by 4 o'clock tomorrow afternoon
Right.
for the
Close
most
to it,
part.
yeah.
For the most part, yeah, by 4 in the afternoon. But we could see the most flooding at that point. How would you describe that?
Right, and the way to think about it is as the storm's pulling away, we're going to have those winds coming in first out of the northeast like we typically see with the nor'easter, then the north, then the northwest. So that's going to pile up the water, pushing it down the Chesapeake Bay. And if you are familiar with the Elizabeth River, it almost runs north to south. You have the southern branch, the eastern, and the western branch. So it's going to push it down the river, and then it's going to spread out to the eastern, western, and mainly go through the southern branches. And that's where we have our tide gauge at Sewell's Point. And Jeff has the tide graphic up now. And we're calling for between 6.5 and we're saying about 7 to maybe even 7.2, which is in that major flood stage. Major flooding begins at 6.5, and we've seen 6.5 quite a bit. Once you get up to that 7, then we're starting to talk about some of the historic storms, like the Ash Wednesday storm. That was 7.2. 7.5 was Irene. Isabel was 7.9. And the big one from 1933 was over 8. That set the all-time record. So we're still talking about likely a foot below the all-time record. But, you know, half a foot below Isabel might not be out of the realm of possibility.
A lot of water.
I'm also, Jeff, did you have something on that?
Well, I was just going to say, and compare it to some of the others as well. So let's say we get the low end. I think there's a slight chance that we could even, a slight chance. Bonnie, for example, was semi-similar to this, but a weaker storm, didn't have the water building up ahead of it. But there are some similarities in terms of the path. That one only brought us 6 feet. I think if things worked out where this was, you know, somehow came the heaviest winds a few hours earlier at low tide or closer to low tide, we might get really lucky and get a 6-foot total surge. So how would that compare? So I've got on here 6.5 to 7 with these numbers. So again, if it comes in at 6, then we're not even going to be like some of the nor'easters. It'll be more like a Hurricane Bonnie was or some of the others. 6.5, I think, is definitely sort of the low end, though, in terms of realistic expectations. That would be like a lot of our nor'easters. It would be like the Columbus Day nor'easter, which was 6.5. Twin nor'easter, we had 2 of them back to back. The number one was like 6.6 feet, and then a week or so later, a couple weeks later, we had just under that. So 2 back to back in 1998. The November nor'easter in 2006 was 6.6 feet. So again, that's along sort of the lower end of what we think we're going to get. Sandy, of course, devastated areas north of here, but we ended up with 6.8 feet from Sandy. So that would be pretty much almost directly in the middle of our range of 6.5 to 7. But as we just showed you, getting up to 7, there's a big difference between 6.5 and 7 when you think about it compared to Isabel. If Isabel was almost 8 feet and we're at 6.5 feet, we're going to end up about 17 inches lower than Isabel.
That's significant.
It is.
Yeah,
it's very significant. So if you had 2 feet of water in your home, you're still going to have problems because you're going to have, 7 inches of water instead, assuming those numbers worked out. Whereas if we end up on the 7.2 range, that then only comes in 6 to 9 inches lower than Isabel, something like that. So it should be lower than Isabel, but the question is how much lower. So hope that answers their question.
And it's difficult comparing one storm to the other because there are so many different factors. The angle of the wind makes a difference. With Isabel, we saw so much damage up around Pocosin. They really got socked in hard.
Yeah.
And there's likely will be somewhere in Hampton Roads that probably gets it worse than what they have in previous storms. There are going to be a lot of places that it's not as bad as previous storms. It's just because the angle of the storm, the angle of the wind, it drives
the timing.
The timing when it's coming in. It just changes how the water worked its way up this particular river versus another river because they're all oriented just a little bit different. So that's something that we can't nail down every single river and every single tributary. I expect there will be some issues along the Nansemond River. That north wind will probably give us some issues on the peninsula, on the north side of the peninsula, on the York River side. Could probably down towards the southern tip of Gloucester County along Mobjack Bay or the northern coast there of Matthews County. We could see some of those issues because of those winds coming in out of the north and the western shores of the eastern shore.
I think Lynnhaven Inlet is a prime candidate as well to get some really significant winds. And again, we can zoom in on weather 1. I'll actually stop this radar loop and show you what we're talking about. We could.
You talk about Bay Island, one of those areas.
Yeah, Bay Island, because you get the northeast wind coming in first. And that northeast wind takes all the ocean water and piles it up here, waiting in the bay. So you've got this huge blob of water just sitting here in the mouth of the bay, waiting to go somewhere. And then as soon as the wind shifts, what happens to that blob of water? Well, as the wind shifts to northwest, it starts coming in from the northwest. So anywhere that opens up to the northwest is going to have an issue, or opens up to the north. And where is that? Well, one area where you don't have hardly anything between it and the water off to your north is Bay Island.
Yep.
And all of those areas there, the Lynn Haven, inlet. You go over here, that's what Evan was talking about, coming in the Elizabeth River, coming in over here's the Nansemond River with that northeast wind. Now, again, they're a little farther inland, so the dome isn't as thick, if you will. The thickest part of the dome is here, where the bulk of the water is located, and then you get, correspondingly lower parts of the dome as you go out away from that sort of area where it's all sitting right there. So that's why I don't expect it to be quite as bad there as maybe, a Bay Island or a Lynn Haven Inlet, but all those north-facing spots, we're going to watch for some serious issues.
We were just looking at a shot from Duck, our live camera down there. So how are the conditions? There it is right there. It looks like, obviously cloudy. What are the conditions right now in that part of the Outer Banks?
Yeah, we're seeing a few showers down there, and Jeff's going to pull up the radar. I think every once in a while you can see a few raindrops showing up there on the camera lens, and even a little bit of some heavier rain down there as well. Jeff is pulling up the radar right there, as you can see, and there's one of those rain bands that's working its way off towards the north. A lot of heavier rain down towards Kinston and areas of northeastern North Carolina, but we are seeing that rain pushing, getting ready to cross over from into Ocracoke Island up towards Hatteras Island. So we're already starting to see the rain bands down there. And
if we are going to get severe weather, it would be, this would be a good candidate. This line down here to the south as it moves northward, that's a pretty potent storm. In fact, let me double check and make sure I have watches, and I know I have watches turned on. I do have warnings as well, so we're not seeing any warnings with it just yet, but it's that type of a line that we would watch for the potential to come north.
And talk about, Jeff, because I had somebody asking me about the lightning, and do we get a lot of lightning in tropical systems? And there is some lightning. It's not normal. I mean, we don't get a lot of lightning with these tropical systems. So how do we get tornadoes when we're not getting these big, massive supercell thunderstorms?
Interesting. I was wondering that myself.
Well, the difference is with a warm core system. Well, I'll start with a regular system. Regular systems, a lot of people know, you go up a mountain, it generally gets colder. So the atmosphere typically gets colder as you go aloft. So whether it's a thunderstorm or anything like that, you have the heat at the ground, the humidity, and then as you go up, you get cooler and cooler. It's anywhere from 3 to 5 degrees Fahrenheit for every 1,000 feet you go up. So you got this air rising. And then to get severe weather on a normal day with a normal thunderstorm, you need cold air. And the cold air then is sinking because colder air is heavier. So as it sinks and the warm air is going up, those two clash and you get the spin to form from sort of different axes, if you will. With a warm core system, these are completely different with a hurricane. A hurricane, you don't get colder and colder air as you go aloft. In fact, it can get warmer as you go aloft or stay the same. So you don't have that mixture of the cold air clashing with the warm air anymore. So what you get instead is a spin that's already built in because of the hurricane. So the whole system is spinning around, it's such a massive rate that it's more of a horizontal shear than a vertical shear that's coming in, and you end up with these little eddies that just spin down. Typically, they're fairly weak. Occasionally, they can get strong. We had one, I can't remember if it was Bonnie or one of them. We had an F3, not category 3, but an F3 tornado that hit Hampton, I remember one year with Fran maybe?
I think it might have been Fran.
I think it might have been Fran, the remnants of that storm, but Bonnie brought us a couple as well. So they can happen where they get to like F3 or so. Actually, Tim and I were looking at a thing yesterday. Ivan, right? Wasn't it Ivan?
It was Ivan.
Side? Ivan, back in, I forget what year, not that long ago, brought the most tornadoes ever to Virginia. I think it was something like 70 tornadoes in Virginia. We don't get half of that in a year, and that brought that in one day. Almost all of those were F0s and F1s, which are weak tornadoes. There were 10 F2s and 1 F3. So similar to what we had with France. So my point is that typically these are very weak. This system, on the other hand, just judging by some of the pictures that we saw when it hit areas there of South Carolina, some of the southern North Carolina areas, I bet those were not F0s and F1s. Those were F3s, at least a couple of those that hit. So there can be stronger ones. They tend to be closer to the center, but that is how, as Evan just asked me to point out, you get a tornado out of a hurricane.
And you don't get a lot of that lightning either, because you get lightning by the static electricity from the hailstones bouncing into each other. Well, if it's as warm up in the top of the hurricane as it is down at the bottom, you don't get the ice forming. So that's why you don't see a lot of lightning. There is some, but you don't see nearly the amount of lightning in a tropical system like you would a normal thunderstorm.
Another question. Dorian was a little indecisive today. She was a 2, and then a 3, then a 2. Yeah. Any chance of it now strengthening?
Not likely.
Very unlikely.
I mean,
okay.
It'll probably hold its own. If it starts to come on shore, then we're going to see that western edge start to erode just a little bit because of some of the interaction with land, although we also start to see that wind field spread out. So I don't think we're going to see any significant signs of strengthening. There's the satellite loop, and that eye isn't looking as concentric as it was. It's looking a little bit dirty. We're not seeing all those bright reds around the center of the storm anymore, and it is interacting with a cold front coming in from the west. That's one of the reasons why it's starting to make that northeastward movement. But a lot of times, as we've seen with some of these tropical systems, once they start interacting with the front, those wind fields start to expand a little bit. So I don't think we're going to see any kind of significant strengthening with the storm.
But it has yet to make landfall.
In the United States, that's correct.
Right. So Hatteras could be that point.
It could be Cape Lookout, it could be Cape Hatteras, it might even be Cape Fear. I think the center might just miss Cape Fear, but it's going to be close to all 3 of those capes. And as you look at right there, the center of the storm is just south of Cape Fear, and you notice how the North Carolina coast, you've got the 3 jagged edges that come out, like the blades of like on a saw blade. And that's the first one is Cape Fear, then you got Cape Lookout and Cape Hatteras, and it's possible if the center of the storm, it could cross over all 3 capes, so you could have conceivably 3 landfalls in the state of North Carolina.
Wow.
And then a 2 hitting North Carolina. It's been a while, or hitting Hatteras or in that area.
Right.
Because Florence was, I know it hit around Wilmington, but I think it had weakened to about a 1 by the time it hit. We'll have to check that. Yeah. All right.
Been through so many.
I know. You see how we have the most accurate team of meteorologists. 9 years in a row right here. So.
That's right. And we've got special coverage coming up tonight. I was going to mention that Jeff just celebrated, what, 30 years?
I started my 30th.
Started your 30th?
That's how old I am.
Today Evan starts his 5th.
25th year.
Starts his 25th year.
That's right.
55 years.
And I started with a hurricane.
Yep.
That was Hurricane Felix when I was off the coast. So my anniversary date, got another one.
I used to watch you guys growing up.
I did watch David when I was in college. I did when I was down in Raleigh. So.
All right. Please make sure you catch our hurricane special coming up at 8 o'clock. It's going to be on from 8 until 11. Then, of course, your news 11 until 11:30. So we appreciate you participating in our Facebook Live. And also log on to 13newsnow.com.